Laura Lee Salmon was born on October 6, 1965. At the time of her death, Laura was attending Middle Tennessee State University in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. She was also working as a cashier at a Kroger grocery store. On May 31, 1984, a farmer made a discovery in a field. He saw a young woman's body lying on the ground. She was only wearing a bra, and was covered with 2 pairs of jeans. The first pair was hers, and the second was a pair of men's jeans. There was also a pair of underwear found in one of her hands. The body was identified as being that of Laura Salmon. Laura's autopsy revealed that she died due to blunt force trauma to the head. At the scene, several rocks were found near her body. The reported suggested that Laura had been hit over the head about 10 times. The medical examiner also found evidence that Laura had consensual sex about 24 to 48 hours before she died. There were no injuries to suggest that she had been sexually assaulted. The men's jeans were examined. The investigators found semen on them. The DNA was collected and sent into the lab for testing. At the time, DNA testing was in its infancy. On May 31, Laura had left Kroger around 1 p.m. She was then supposed to attend a meeting to check her grades at MTSU, and then go swimming at her grandmother's. Laura never showed up to her meeting at the university. Laura's car was found near the grocery store. There were no fingerprints inside, but the police did find a foreign hair. They also found dirt and debris in the wheels, on the driver's side floor, on the passenger's side floor mat, and on the floor of the rear passenger's side. The debris was consistent with that of the debris found at the crime scene. On May 30th, witnesses said they had seen Laura dancing with a man at nightclub. The man was later revealed to be one of Laura's friends. The area where Laura had been found was a known lovers' lane and party area. The first person that the police interviewed was Kyle Gilley, Laura's high school boyfriend. Kyle was known to be very jealous, and had been abusive to Laura in the past. Kyle denied having been involved, and said he had an alibi. His father confirmed that he had been at home all night. The police didn't look much further into Kyle, which really upset Laura's mom. A woman in Nashville, Tennessee contacted the police. She told them that she had been sexually assaulted by a man, and that he threatened that she would end up like Laura. The man was questioned. He denied the assault or knowing Laura. But the police did discover that he was a student at MTSU, and had been on campus the day Laura died. He also had a history of being violent towards women. The man's hair was compared to the foreign hair found in Laura's car. At first, the crime lab said it was consistent to the hair found in the car. The man was also too small to fit into the men's jeans found at the scene. The waist was 30 inches, and the inseam was 36. Eventually, this man was cleared, as his hair and DNA was not a match. The police interviewed over 100 suspects in this case, but they were all dead ends. Laura's case went cold for 16 years before it was reopened by a cold case led by Laura's friend, Dan Goodwin. Dan Goodwin had went into journalism after college. He said he was more interested in the police investigations, and joined the force. Dan and Laura went to the movies on May 27, 1984. Dan was asked to give a sample of his DNA, but it wasn't a match. Dan and Lieutenant Bill Sharp sent all of the evidence to the crime lab again. They learned about another suspect named David. David's son had been attending Oakland High School in 2000. Laura had graduated from the same high school years earlier. David's son claimed that his dad had killed Laura, and dumped her in the lover's lane/quarry. David was eventually cleared. He had been dead for a few years, but his children voluntarily gave the police samples of their DNA to compare to the sample from the jeans. The evidence led the police back to one person, Kyle Gilley. Dan Goodwin and Bill Sharp learned that there had been an eyewitness back in 1984. The eyewitness had seen Kyle driving Laura's car on May 31st. She pointed Kyle's photo and Laura's car out of photo lineups. She described Kyle as having a blank look on his face and staring straight ahead. By 2000, Kyle was living in Florida, had been divorced twice, and worked in the Manatee County Public Works Department. Kyle also had a criminal history for aggravated sexual battery, attempted burglary, and resisting arrest. Kyle was interviewed in Florida. He still denied killing Laura, and asked for a lawyer. He did give a sample of his DNA, which came back as being a match to the semen on the jeans. A new crime scene analyst had also found medium-velocity blood spatter on the knee area of the jeans. The analyst said that the killer had been kneeling as he struck Laura with the rocks. Kyle Gilley was arrested and charged with murder. Laura's mom, Lynette, had told the original investigators that she knew Kyle had killed her daughter. She said the original investigators didn't take her seriously. The motive seemed to be jealousy. Laura had been a year older than Kyle, and he became even more jealousy when she left for college. Laura started to spend time with new friends, and began seeing other people when they broke up. The prosecution and police believed that Kyle had followed Laura to the nightclub on the night before she died. On May 31st, Laura had plans to go swimming, and maybe invited Kyle to go with her. Kyle and Laura ended up at the quarry where they had a fight. Kyle killed Laura, and left his jeans there because he noticed they had blood on them. In September 2006, Kyle went on trial. His defense claimed that there was unknown DNA found at the crime scene, which was proof that Kyle was innocent. Kyle was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. In 2008, Kyle lost his appeal, and his conviction was upheld. Dan Goodwin said, "Kyle Gilley is going to be where he belongs for the rest of his life. It's pretty clear to me that they have the right person in prison." Kyle had always been jealous of Laura spending time with other people. Laura tried to get away from Kyle, while still being nice to him. I mean, she probably still had a lot of feelings for him. Kyle was angry, and killed Laura for no reason. Luckily, he's dumb as shit and left behind his DNA. It took almost 20 years, but Laura and her family finally got the justice they deserve. A man who got a teenage girl hooked on drugs and forced her into prostitution to fund his own habit before killing her has been jailed. Rachel Wilson, 19, went missing in Middlesbrough in 2002. Her body was found on a farm 10 years later. Keith Hall, 62, lied for years about dumping her body in a shallow grave but kept a lock of her hair in his wallet, Cleveland police said. He was jailed for 18.5 years after admitting manslaughter. Hall, of Lambton Road in Grove Hill, Middlesbrough, also admitted living off prostitution money earned by his victim and perverting the course of justice. The Crown Prosecution Service said it had not been able to pursue a murder conviction because it would have been very difficult to prove Hall's intent. Ms. Wilson was last seen in May 2002 and her disappearance was the subject of multiple police appeals until June 2012, when her remains were found in a shallow grave on farmland near Coolby, Newham. The perverting the course of justice charge related to Hall trying to get a witness to change a police statement about a comment in which he incriminated himself over Ms. Wilson's death. No details have ever been given about how she died. Jonathan Sandiford prosecuting said, by the time Rachel Wilson disappeared in May 2002 her existence had become a misery, blighted by her own addiction to controlled drugs but also by the mistreatment and violence she received at the hands of the defendant. Witnesses said she was afraid of Hall and sometimes had bruises on her neck and body from his attacks. It was suspected that he beat her one final time, killing her when she returned after a night on the streets with what Hall thought was not enough cash, although the judge said no one apart from the defendant knew exactly what had happened. Temporary debt sup Paula Dool said Hall was a compulsive liar who concocted convoluted stories to try and get away with the killing. She said a lock of Ms. Wilson's hair was found in his wallet along with a note written by her apologizing for not making enough money, which was effectively her last written words. Ms. Dool said Hall had been spoken to 8 or 9 times by police after Ms. Wilson went missing, but it was only when her body was found in 2012 and an official murder inquiry was launched that people came forward with significant information about him. She said Hall met Ms. Wilson when she was 15 or 16 and quickly started a relationship with her. He then introduced her to crack cocaine and used physical and psychological abuse to push her into prostitution to fund his habit. Ms. Wilson's sister Nicola Wilson said, "The Rachel we remember was very happy and bubbly. She was amazing. Anybody can get sucked into that lifestyle, and as we know now, Rachel was forced into it. She was a child and wouldn't have had any idea of what was happening to her. That was heartbreaking." She also said it was a torment for the family not knowing what had happened to Ms. Wilson for so long. The murder of Lynette White in 1988 led to one of Britain's most notorious miscarriages of justice. Her killer was finally jailed in 2003 after 15 years. But what else do we know about her and the murder? Lynette White was murdered on February 14, 1988, in her Docklands flat in Cardiff. Before the fatal incident, the 20-year-old had been working as a prostitute in the city centre. 5 days before her murder, White went missing and made no contact with any of her friends or known associates. The reason for her disappearance during this period has never been ascertained. She was due to be called as a witness for the prosecution in 2 forthcoming trials but was reportedly laying low. On the evening of February 14, police forced entry into a flat on James Street as they searched for the missing witness and found Lynette's body inside. She had been stabbed more than 60 times by an unknown assailant. After the murder, South Wales police issued a photo-fit image of a bloodstained, white male seen near the scene of the crime but were unable to trace him. In November 1988, police charged 5 black and mixed-race men with Lynette's murder despite having no scientific evidence linked to them being at the crime scene. The men, who became known as the Cardiff Five, were unexpectedly arrested in response to local yacht club secretary Violet Perriam telling detectives she remembered seeing a number of suspicious black men near the flat where Lynette was killed. The 5 men were quickly accused of the murder, despite the police having previously said they were looking for a lone white male. In November 1990, after the longest murder trial in British history, 3 of them were found guilty and were sentenced to life imprisonment. The real murderer was Geoffrey Gafford. In September 2000, an independent review into unsolved murders in South Wales paved the way for a fresh inquiry. 8 years later, South Wales police reopened the case and discovered fresh forensic evidence at the scene, including specks of blood on the cellophane wrapper of a cigarette packet and on a skirting board, which had since been painted over. This started the hunt for a new suspect who was dubbed the Cellophane Man. After scientists looked into one of the rare DNA components, they narrowed down a list of people who had that component, with one result particularly sticking out. That partial match was with a youth who was not born when the 1988 killing took place, but who had had dealings with the police. But testing of the 14-year-old's family found a close relative whose DNA matched that of Cellophane Man's, and he was instantly suspected as Lynette's murderer. That relative's name was Geoffrey Gafford, who had worked as a security guard at his family's shop in nearby Roath at the time of Lynette's death. In 2003, Gafford was arrested by police, but in a bid to avoid justice the suspect attempted to commit suicide by taking an overdose of pills when he realized he was about to be apprehended. But, as police had Gafford under surveillance, they prevented him from doing so and took him to hospital. It was on his way to get medical attention that he confessed to killing Lynette. Gafford was sentenced at Cardiff Crown Court to life in prison for the 1988 murder. The defendant had explained to the court that on the last night of Lynette's life, he had paid her for sex up front but changed his mind when he saw the state of her flat in Butestown, which had no electricity or running water. He then demanded back his £30, which she refused, before attacking her in fury. Prosecutor Patrick Harrington described the moment Gafford confessed to the court. He took a deep breath and said, "Just for the record, I did kill Lynette White. I have been waiting for this for 15 years. Whatever happens to me, I deserve it." He was ordered to serve a minimum of 13 years. Mr. Justice John Royce, who sentenced Gafford, said, "For 15 years, you kept your guilty secret and evaded justice even while others stood trial for the murder you knew that you had committed. The notorious murderer has not been deemed suitable for release, according to the parole board." The coronavirus pandemic prevented Gafford from making as much progress as hoped, since he was transferred to an open prison in September 2020. While in prison, Gafford has reportedly taken part in programs to address his decision-making, better ways of thinking and tendency to use violence. In 2023, it was recommended that Gafford could be allowed out on day release, but was not yet suitable to be allowed out on license following a parole board review. In 1983 and then 1986, the villages of Narborough and Enderby were shaken by the deaths of 2 local teenage girls, who were attacked and killed in very similar circumstances. On November 21, 1983, 15-year-old Lynda Mann took a shortcut on her way home from babysitting. When she did not return home, her parents and neighbors spent the night searching for her. The next morning, she was found raped and strangled on a deserted footpath known locally as the Black Pad. There were not enough leads or enough evidence to connect anybody to the murder, and the case was left open. 3 years later, on July 31, 1986, a second 15-year-old girl, Dawn Ashworth, left her home to visit a friend's house. 2 days later, her body was found in a wooded area near a footpath called 10-Pound Lane. She had been beaten, raped and strangled to death. Police linked the two attacks as having possibly been carried out by the same person, and forensic evidence revealed the same blood type. DNA profiling was first developed in 1985 by Alec Jeffreys, along with Peter Gill and Dave Warrett. One of the key factors of their work would prove invaluable in rape cases. It meant that police were able to link a semen sample taken from Mann's body to a person with type A blood and an enzyme profile that matched only 10% of males. Gill said at the time, the biggest achievement was developing the preferential extraction method to separate sperm from vaginal cells. Without this method, it would have been difficult to use DNA in rape cases. Using this technique, Jeffreys compared semen samples from both murder victims against a blood sample from the initial suspect, Richard Buckland, and conclusively proved that both girls were killed by the same man, which wasn't Buckland. He became the first person to have his innocence established by DNA fingerprinting. The police then tested the DNA of 5,500 local men, but with no positive matches. On August 1, 1987, Ian Kelly, a colleague of Colin Pitchfork, a bakery worker from Newbold Verdon, Leicestershire, revealed in a Leicester pub that he had taken Pitchfork's blood test for him, helping him to fake it. Pitchfork had told Kelly that he could not give blood under his own name because he had already given blood while pretending to be a friend of his who had been convicted for burglary. A woman overheard the conversation and then reported it to police. On September 19, 1987, Pitchfork was arrested, and his DNA matched that of the sample found on the girls' bodies. He pleaded guilty to the 2 rape and murders in addition to another incident of sexual assault, and was sentenced to life imprisonment. The Secretary of State set a minimum term of 30 years for his sentence, but in 2009 it was reduced on appeal to 28 years. In July this year, it was announced he would be released from prison after the parole board rejected a government challenge to keep him locked up. In June, the government called for a review into Pitchfork's risk after the parole board announced that they were satisfied he was safe to be released. However, the parole board rejected the government challenge against its ruling and Pitchfork, now 61, was released in September. The government challenge, from Lord Chancellor Robert Buckland, had claimed the decision to free Pitchfork was irrational, because the parole board panel failed to give sufficient reasons as to why it agreed with the evidence provided by professionals. However, Judge Michael Topolsky QC, who reviewed the decision for the parole board, said he did not agree that the decision was irrational and decided that application for reconsideration is refused. This was and remains a case of considerable seriousness, complexity and notoriety, he added. The terrible consequences of the brutal rapes and murders of 2 innocent girls will forever darken the lives of the families concerned. He's now subject to 36 strict monitoring conditions on top of the standard restrictions placed on anyone serving part of their sentence in the community. When he is released from prison, Pitchfork will still be subject to strict license conditions. Anthony Sanchez waits on death row, his execution just months away. He is going to pay the ultimate price for a rape and murder he did not commit, according to his father's former girlfriend, who says Sanchez Sr. confessed to the crime to her. Speaking to the media for the first time, Charlotte Beatty told Newsweek that Thomas Glenn Sanchez repeatedly admitted to killing Julie Busken before his death. He told me about it a few times, saying that he had to hogtie her 'cause she squealed, she said. He said after he finished the job with her, he just shot her in the head. She feared the same fate would befall her if she ever told anyone. I was afraid, because he'd say that he could end up doing to me as he did to Julie Busken, she said. Busken, a 21-year-old ballerina from Benton, Arkansas, had just finished her final semester at the University of Oklahoma when she was abducted from her apartment in Norman on December 20, 1996. Her body was found near Lake Stanley Draper that evening. Authorities said she had been bound, raped and shot in the back of the head. After 8 years of few leads, police charged the then 25-year-old Sanchez Jr. in 2004. Investigators said a DNA sample taken from him when he was imprisoned for burglary had matched DNA recovered from the pink leotard found on Busken's body. 2 years on, he was convicted and sentenced to die. Now 44, he is set to receive a lethal injection on September 21. He has always maintained he did not kill Busken, telling Newsweek from prison that he was convicted on pure circumstantial evidence. Beatty and others who believe in his innocence are now scrambling to save his life. An attorney for Sanchez Jr. asked the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals for an evidentiary hearing earlier this year, alleging that his father was the actual killer. In the court filing, Mark Barrett wrote that Beatty first heard Sanchez Sr. confess in July of 2020 but was too afraid of him to come forward while he was alive. The filing noted that neither of the two eyewitnesses identified Sanchez Jr. as the perpetrator during their testimonies and that evidence taken from Busken's vehicle, including 49 fingerprints and hair, were not matched to him. Importantly, the filing said, a police sketch crafted with the help of a witness who saw Busken and the perpetrator appears to match a photo of Sanchez Sr. taken in 1996. The court last month rejected the claim, with Judge David Lewis writing in a ruling, indeed, considering the remaining evidence, even if Glenn Sanchez had confessed his guilt on the witness stand under oath at Anthony Sanchez's murder trial, no reasonable fact finder would have acquitted Anthony Sanchez of killing Julie Busken. In a statement to Newsweek, Oklahoma Attorney General Gentner Drummond said the evidence is overwhelming that Anthony Sanchez brutally raped and murdered Julie Busken. Instead of expressing remorse, he made the cowardly decision to try blaming the crime on his deceased father, a ludicrous allegation thoroughly discredited by DNA analysis. What makes this claim all the more despicable is that it makes a mockery of how advances in DNA evidence have exonerated wrongly convicted individuals in recent years. Just as DNA evidence has helped clear the innocent, it can also conclusively show guilt. Anthony Sanchez is guilty beyond any conceivable doubt, and I will ensure justice is served. Advocates for Sanchez have questioned the DNA evidence used to secure the conviction, saying it was mishandled and manipulated, and argue other evidence, including ballistic evidence, was not credibly connected to Sanchez Jr. He said he had been let down by his trial lawyers, who he said didn't check his alibis or even his address. He didn't live a mile from Busken at the time of her murder like prosecutors alleged, he said, but in the next town over. Prosecutors at trial said Busken's missing cell phone was used to call a number belonging to an ex-girlfriend of Sanchez Jr.'s. He insists it wasn't the right number. Sanchez Jr. was a boy who had to raise himself, Beatty recalled. She remembers his father as an alcoholic and opioid abuser with a short temper who physically and sexually abused her for years. He took his own life on her front porch on the evening of April 24 last year, she said. He was 68. Beatty met Sanchez Sr. in meat-cutting school in the early 1990s, but they lost touch when she moved. In 1994, she said he contacted her and told her he had divorced. I started going around with him and we just went places and we had a nice time, she said. The following year, she gave birth to their son, now 27. Just months earlier, he had met another woman who would go on to become his third wife. But he kept on coming back and forth, Beatty said, adding that he often mooched off her to pay for his drinking. And over the years, he started getting more hateful, she said. He took his anger out on her, she said, describing in graphic terms the sexual assaults he subjected her to. If I screamed, he'd go further, she said. He was also impotent, she remembered, which often made him more vicious in his abuse. Beatty said Sanchez Sr. first mentioned Busken's killing to her several years ago, but then kept on bringing it up. He'd say, I'll hunt you down and I'll kill you if you say something, she said. That's how he was whenever he was telling me about Julie Busken. There were a few times he talked about it sober. He just kept on talking about it. Sanchez Sr. was diagnosed with cancer in February last year, Beatty said. A lump on his neck grew to the size of a baseball by the end, meaning he couldn't talk much. He never expressed remorse, she said. He just kept on saying that at least Anthony's a man. I'd say, why would you want him to suffer for it? He said, well, because he's young, and he can handle it. David Ballard, an investigator hired by Sanchez Jr.'s attorney and death penalty opponents to examine the case, said he found that many who knew Sanchez Sr. described him as paranoid, and that most who knew him were affected by his abuse. That includes Kathy Hodge, who married Sanchez Sr. in 1980 when Anthony was a little over a year old. I raised him, she told Newsweek. She spoke of the physical abuse she regularly suffered over the course of the 14-year marriage. It started off just a slap here, slap there, and it got worse and worse, she said. During the week, everything was normal. It was usually on the weekends when he started drinking, and he would get to a certain point and then he got real abusive. But what many who knew the father and son agree on is that the police sketch looks a lot like Sanchez Sr. and nothing like his son. That sketch shows an apparently older man with hollowed cheekbones and shoulder-length hair. Sanchez Jr. was a teenager with hair down his back at the time of Buskin's killing. It did resemble Glenn. It didn't look anything like Anthony, Hodge said. I believe in his innocence, 100%. There's too many things that prove he didn't do it. Sanchez Jr. does not want to believe his father committed the crime he may soon pay the ultimate price for, but he concedes that the sketch does resemble his dad. I have very mixed emotions about it, he said. It does look like my father. The Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation in February compared Sanchez's DNA to that recovered from Buskin's leotard, the Oklahoman reported, and concluded the DNA did not match that from Buskin's leotard. The state's attorneys said the new tests were conducted in an effort to fully and unequivocally debunk the new claim. Ballard, the investigator hired by Sanchez Jr.'s lawyer, questioned the DNA handling and profiling, a technology in its infancy at the time, that was done in the case. The testing and results were questionable at best, he said. It needs to be redone. A spokesperson for the Attorney General's office said there was no evidence to suggest the DNA was not properly collected or stored. The spokesperson said the profile obtained from Buskin's leotard by the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation in 2000 matched exactly to a DNA profile separately obtained by Oklahoma City Police. Sanchez Sr. was excluded, but the testing found that it was highly likely to belong to the biological father of the attacker. Ballard, president of Valor Investigations LLC of Norman, said he feels confident that Sanchez Jr. did not kill Buskin, noting that the heinous crime pointed to someone with a propensity to violence. He didn't match the profile, the physical evidence isn't there, and there's just a lot of conjecture on his case, Ballard said. There are things right now that can be done on the Anthony Sanchez case that could very much clear his name that we're not in possession of. Fingerprints, skin cells and hair found in Buskin's vehicle should be tested against Sanchez Sr.'s, he said. Sanchez Jr.'s attorneys and advocates also dispute the state's assertion that a shoe print at the crime scene was connected to him. They never found the shoe, Ballard noted, but an ex-girlfriend told authorities that he owned a similar pair. The print was of a size 9, Ballard says. If they checked my foot, they would have known I was size 11.5, Sanchez Jr. said. And it's a mass-produced shoe, Ballard added. There's so many unanswered questions, and a lot of the evidence was inconclusive, but labeled as, "this matches." Ballard said a detective had looked at Sanchez Sr. as a more plausible suspect early on in the investigation but was shut down. The Reverend Jeff Hood, who met Sanchez Jr. last summer, told Newsweek he was initially skeptical of Sanchez's innocence claim. It was the sketch that made him delve deeper and team up with Death Penalty Action, a non-profit organization that works to stop executions and abolish the death penalty, to raise funds to pay for the investigator. Hood said he feels the state jumped to test Sanchez Sr.'s DNA earlier this year without being ordered to do so in a bid to cut us off before we were able to present evidence of what we feel like was DNA manipulation at the very beginning. He argued that Sanchez Jr., who is Native American, has as strong an innocence claim as another inmate on death row in Oklahoma, Richard Glossop, who is white. Glossop was accused of ordering the 1997 killing of motel owner Barry Van Trees but has maintained his innocence, and there have been persistent doubts about the evidence against him. "We want the Glossop treatment," he said. "We want a person of color who has an innocence claim in Oklahoma to be taken as seriously as a white person who has an innocence claim in Oklahoma." Abraham Bonowitz, Death Penalty Action's executive director, praised legislators and Oklahoma's attorney general for exploring Glossop's case. "The real test," Bonowitz said, "is if Oklahoma's political leaders will similarly step up for Sanchez. His life is valuable too. There are real and urgent questions about his guilt also," Bonowitz said. "He deserves every bit as much of a reinvestigation as Glossop got." Hood has already accompanied two men to the death chamber this year, Scott Eisenberg in Oklahoma and Arthur Brown Jr. in Texas, and watched as the lethal injection coursed through their veins. He doesn't want to do it again with Sanchez Jr. On Thursday morning, he and others will gather at the Oklahoma State Capitol to launch a campaign aimed at saving Sanchez's life. "Sanchez is a test," Hood said, "of whether there is even a modicum of morality left in the governance of the state of Oklahoma. If they can't stop themselves from killing a demonstrably innocent man, I pray that God damns them all." Thank you for watching. Make sure you subscribe and like the video, and click the bell icon to stay tuned.